a few words about today's talk. I've been giving, this is kind of like the second anniversary of my giving these talks. And the one today is a little unusual, and I try to pair them. I do 2 a month. So this one is paired with the next one. And what this is intended to do is, it's the only talk I give. I give 24 different lectures on the home front. This is the only one that deals with military matters. Everything else is home front subject matter, one kind or another. But I got thinking about this place and what went on here in World War II, and sometimes it's difficult to understand why. So many resources were poured into this, why it was considered so important. You probably know, if you've had any chance to walk around here today, that this was the largest shipbuilding complex in the world at the time during World War II. Why all the resources, why all the importance, why all the attention? And the more I got thinking about it, the more important the Battle of the Atlantic was to this whole story. So this is intended to kind of introduce you to the reason, the rationale, the justification for this place, why so many ships were built here so quickly. And then as a lead-in to next session on the last Sunday in July, when we'll talk actually about these shipyards and how they operated and how the ships were built and that kind of thing. But I definitely wanted to start with this. First of all, let me kind of plumb your knowledge. What is the Battle of the Atlantic? Have you ever heard that phrase before? Mm-hmm.
It was a battle against the Nazi U-boats.
Okay.
To try to keep getting freight from the U.S. to England, and the U-boats kept sinking all the ships, and so they had to go and try to sink more U-boats than the U-boats sank of our ships. I guess that's sort of what I know.
Yeah, that's very good. And it took place half a world away in the Atlantic Ocean. But it had a definite impact on why there was so much emphasis on speed, on production, on everything else. So that's what I want to talk about today with you, is what's called the Battle of the Atlantic, submarine warfare, and how it led to the Richmond shipyards and why we have so much emphasis on shipbuilding. And here's a Liberty ship. Hundreds of them were built here. 747 ships altogether in World War II. Mostly Liberty ships and what we call Victory ships, a smaller number of those because we didn't start manufacturing them until 1944, toward the end of the war. But they're cargo ships. And so why is a cargo ship so important? That's one of the things I want to talk about with you today. We're talking about the Battle of the Atlantic. We're not talking about a battle such as, let's say, D-Day or Iwo Jima that took place over a few days. This will take place over a period of several years. And for that reason, it's kind of a complicated subject, and I've broken it down into different sections to explain to you how we end up getting to the shipyards. But even though it takes place over several years, I want to start with one day that was important in World War II, and that was September 3rd, 1939. That was when the Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, and on September 3rd, the British and the French declared war, and the European phase of World War II had started at that point. When I taught a course on World War II, my favorite trick question to ask the students the first week was, because I knew a lot of them knew quite a bit about World War II, was when did World War II begin? If you think about that for a second, it's kind of a trick question, isn't it? Because it depends on your perspective. So the obvious answer I got from the students was December 7th, 1941. And that's obviously an important date. But we could go back to 1937, the Japanese invasion of China. We could talk about June of 1941, when the Soviet Union got involved in the war. So it happened incrementally, but certainly this is an important date. On that day, on September 3rd, two things happened. One was war was declared, and we have the first official torpedoing going on in the Atlantic Ocean. And it was the Athenia, sunk by a German submarine on the Atlantic Ocean on that day. So you have the sinking picture on the left and the declaration of war on the right. And I'd also like to start with a quote from Winston Churchill. Certainly somebody who experienced the war from a variety of theaters he was concerned about, whether it was North Africa or Europe or the Far East. He had a lot on his plate, I think we can safely say, as the Prime Minister of Britain during the war. But he did say this: "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. It did not take the form of flaring tables and glittering achievements. It manifested itself through statistics, diagrams, and curves unknown to the nation, incomprehensible to the public." So in Churchill's own mind, what we're about to talk about this afternoon, the submarine warfare on the Atlantic Ocean, was of supreme importance for Allied victory. Why was it so important? Why were the cargo ships so important to the war? There's several reasons. First of all, let's start with Great Britain. Under normal circumstances, it needed to have a huge volume of imports to survive without a war going on. One mega statistic dominated all others. Britain needed a minimum of 23 million tons of supplies every year in normal peacetime. And that had to be transported across the Atlantic. 75% of its food, almost 100% of its oil. This is before North Sea oil was discovered. And the Germans saw this, as they did in World War I, as an opportunity to cut the island off and basically starve it in the war through submarine warfare. But that was only half of it for Britain. The other was that Britain had an empire, and that empire was connected through shipping. And so to remain connected to Africa, to the Middle East, to New Zealand, to Australia, don't forget at the time these were all part of the British Empire, Hong Kong, Singapore, shipping was critical to that. But we go beyond the Great Britain here. In June of 1941, the Soviet Union entered the war. It needed to be supplied by shipping. And there were three ways it was done. Through Vladivostok, we're going to talk about the Murmansk run a little bit and how dramatic that was, but also through Persia and on the Pacific coast. All of those areas were vital shipping needs. And it was through a program called Lend-Lease that the Soviets were supplied. Almost all the trucks they used, for example, were Studebakers. How did they get there? In the holds of the ships that you're learning about while you're in Rosie the Riveter. But we don't stop there. We have Great Britain, we have the Soviet Union, we also have D-Day. Imagine the buildup that had to take place when Britain became basically an aircraft carrier for American troops and supplies and so on. And the buildup for D-Day started in 1943. Before this could happen, huge numbers of troops, weapons, supplies, all had to transit safely across the Atlantic. In other words, we would not have had D-Day if the submarine threat had not been removed by 1943. Just one statistic here. George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, once said that it took 144,000 tons of shipping to move a single infantry division to England, and twice that for an armored division. So you get some idea. And anyone know what these ships could hold in their ton in terms of the tonnage? About 10,000 tons, both the Liberty ship and the Victory ship. So if you do the math here, that's quite a few voyages that have to make it across in order to support the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and then the D-Day buildup, all of them. What it all came down to, control of the shipping lanes was important, especially for cargo ships. Now, the way I want to kind of organize this for you and make it a little clearer is to break it down into 4 phases. And we're going to have quite a few changes happening in this 4 phases. And phase 1 lasted from that date we talked about, September 3rd, 1939, until the summer of 1940. In other words, this is before the U.S. even entered the war. But as we're going to see, that doesn't mean we're not involved, or we're increasingly involved. Before I get into submarines, I just wanted to mention something really quickly to you, which is the surface raiding that went on the Atlantic with German surface ships. The three outstanding threats to Britain, especially, were the Graf Spee, the Atlantis, and the Bismarck. It's the Graf Spee. And the real threat was the Bismarck. All of these were sunk. The Bismarck was sunk off the coast of France in May of 1941. And so surface raiding was largely not a problem. The Germans simply did not have that many surface ships. But they were a nuisance in addition to the submarines for shipping on the Atlantic. But let's take a look at our real story here, the submarines. What can we say about them? Well, first of all, they were one of the things that the Germans had used submarine warfare in the First World War between 1914 and 1918. But the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 basically removed all of their submarines. So they wanted to build them up again, and in 1935 there was a really important treaty with Britain that enabled the Germans to begin to rebuild their submarine fleet, and the number they set was 57. That meant that the British could have 57 submarines and the Germans could have 57 submarines. And here's a typical German U-boat. There were two types at the beginning of the war. There was one called the Type 7. It had a range of 7,000 miles, which was much further than its World War I predecessor. It was seaworthy, it was easy to build. It could dive 750 feet. It held 11 to 14 torpedoes and a heavily cramped crew of 44. And it could stay submerged for 24 hours, as long as the battery lasted. And here's a German U-boat crew. By the way, I'm going to mention this later. This branch of the German military lost more of its people than any branch in any service in any country. About 75% of them didn't return from service by the end of the war. Now, we have to keep something in mind about these submarines. One historian described them, he wouldn't even call them submarines. He said they were surface ships that could go underwater for a short time. The thing about them that one thing that's going to keep coming up today is speed. The speed of the cargo ships and the speed of the submarines. Now, this is really important what I'm about to tell you in terms of speed here. On the surface, the Type 7 could go at 17 knots. Submerged, 7 knots. A Liberty ship, 11. Which means that if they're on the surface, they're fast. They can get ahead of the cargo ships. If they're submerged, they fall behind. So you don't want to have them submerged any longer than you actually have to be. In fact, most of the attacks that took place, despite Hollywood movies and so on, when they left to look through the periscope, were on the surface at night when they used torpedoes. Most of these are going to be surface attacks, actually. The other type, here are the two types. Type 7 on the left. I hadn't mentioned the Type 9 yet. That was the other one. Larger than Type 7. 13,000-mile range, carrying 22 torpedoes. It's interesting that most countries had torpedo problems at the beginning of the war, except for Japan, which had excellent torpedoes. But our torpedoes were terrible. They would keep bouncing off of ships. We had all kinds of problems with them. Yeah, question?
When you say 13,000-mile range,
yeah,
does that mean it can go 13,000 miles without refueling? Or what does that mean?
My understanding is yes. Yeah. Okay. Now, they did have, I'm going to talk about resupply in a minute, but it did have that kind of range, at least initially. The person in charge, Karl Dönitz, he really was the master of the German torpedo program. He was kind of to torpedoes what Heinz Guderian was to the Blitzkrieg on land. He studied it and given it a great deal of thought. He was appointed in 1935, the same year that really important naval agreement went into effect with London, and the submarine force was rebuilt. His boss, the two of them didn't get along all that well, was Erich Riveter. He was the head of the German Navy. And like a lot of senior naval people at the beginning of the war, the surface fleet was what he valued more than anything else. Dönitz said, you know, all of our resources should be going into submarines to strangle the Atlantic. Riveter had different ideas, even though he was supportive to some extent of submarine warfare. Now, the tactic that was developed here, we have, you know, on land, the Blitzkrieg. Here it was the wolf pack. And Dönitz, as much as anybody, was responsible for devising this mode of attack against Allied shipping. And keep in mind that most attacks took place at night on the surface. I'm going to describe that a little bit, how the wolf pack actually worked in a minute, but I want to talk about the limitations at first, the frustrations that Dönitz faced. First of all, only 57 U-boats. Only 22 of these was useful for ocean service at any one time, or they were in maintenance. About only 10 could actually be out on patrol. That's to cover the entire Atlantic at the beginning of the war. And Dönitz told Hitler, I need 300, not 57. So you can see how far, in Dönitz's mind, he was away from an ideal situation. The other thing is they had a long way to go. They had to, at the beginning of the war, they had to go around north of Scotland to get out into the Atlantic. And also, there was a shortage of steel for building shipping, so they had he had quite a challenge to begin with. I'm going to be showing you a whole series of these maps. And the thing to look at here are the red dots. This is phase one. And you can see the dots are kind of crowded toward Europe. They don't go out in the middle of the Atlantic at all. And they're really limited in their range. This is when he had only 57 submarines to work with. He has to go around Scotland, so it's fairly limited here.
Yeah, so that's why the conquest of Norway was so important to the Nazis.
You're
It's the only way they could get north of Scotland.
Norway and
Sweden and Denmark. Or
about
not Sweden, I guess, but Denmark.
about here.
Oh, and the coast of France.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
That's really important what you just said. It was really important to this whole thing. Well, what did the British have in phase one? About 3,000 merchant ships, by far the largest fleet in the world. The basic ship was the British Ocean-class ship and its close American cousin, the Liberty ship. Now, when I talk next week about the ships, actually, and how they're built, they're virtually the same. They took the same, and it's a really antiquated design, especially the engines on these ships. And it's almost cynical. They were designed to be built quickly, and they figured they were going to sink most of them anyway, so don't make them state-of-the-art. Just to show you how old the engine was, a triple expansion steam engine on these ships. How many of you have seen Titanic? Movie Titanic. Okay. There's a wonderful, I love all the technical stuff that's worked into that movie. And they have a scene where the lovers are running, they're trying to escape the villain, and they go through the engine room, and you get to see the engine. Don't forget, the Titanic sank in 1912. That engine room scene was filmed aboard the Jeremiah O'Brien here in San Francisco, a Liberty ship from World War II. So you get an idea of how antiquated these engines really were. It could hold, as we said, 10,000 tons of cargo. It was 440 feet long. This was a Liberty ship or the British Ocean-class ship. They're very similar. The crew, about 48 to 60 merchant marines and 20 to 41 naval personnel. They were there for the guns. It had one 5-inch gun, one 3-inch gun. And here's a cutaway drawing. By the way, I should, this could also almost be a Liberty ship. They were very similar. They have basically 5 cargo holds. But that's where the theater is above the Red Oak. There you can see World War II movies. Speak, what a talk be without ads. We throw a few ads in there. The defense that was used against this threat was something the British had developed from World War, which is the convoy system. Ships would be safer if they could go out in large numbers with the submarine threat. And it was revived on September 2nd, 1939, just the day before World War was declared. It would usually, a typical convoy, as it would form, it took a lot of time to form on the East Coast and in Canada to be able to cross the Atlantic, would have about 60 to 80 ships in it that would form a huge moving rectangle on the Atlantic, about 6 miles wide, 1 mile long, with the most vulnerable ships in the center, accompanied by escort ships. A slow convoy could make about 10 to 12 knots. Again, if we're looking at the Liberty ship, had a speed of about 12 knots, so that would fit that. And here's a kind of convoy diagram. There's a wonderful movie, I love these old war movies, called Action in the North Atlantic. I don't know if you've seen that. What I love about it is it has a scene where a convoy planning scene in it. Kind of boring, but it does tell you a lot about this. They would have the captains come and tell them, they would give them a number here. And that meant that you had a certain ship to the left of you, to the right of you, and you had to maintain a certain distance. It was very much almost like a football team or a basketball team. They had to function as a group with extreme coordination if they were to survive and get across. And they were only as fast as the slowest ship in the convoy. They didn't have much in terms of escorts to begin with, the British. Oh, I found that little postcard, I thought you'd like it. Sailors, their own convoy when they're on leave. I think that's a British postcard. The Corvette, and this was one of the escort ships that we had, especially toward the beginning of the war. There were also sloops, trawlers, frigates, a variety of small ships that were used, but the most common was the Corvette. It was based on a whale catcher. It was small, cheap, fast to build, like the Liberty ships. And many were built in Canadian shipyards, and they had Canadian crews. This was legendarily an ugly ship with an ugly experience if you were assigned to it. They did poorly on the open ocean. Again, they were really designed for the coast. One crew member described the Corvette as a bathtub, and water would slosh in from all sides, especially in heavy seas. You'd be soaking wet a great deal of the time, and crew members could sometimes be wet for weeks at a time. It was armed with a 4-inch gun with 2 rails of depth charges in the back. Sometimes they didn't even have that. It would sometimes sail with telephone poles, in other words, fake guns, so that through a periscope it would look like they had a real gun. One Corvette actually left Britain on escort duty with nothing but 1 Enfield rifle on board. That's all it had. So austerity was the key here. To make it worse, Churchill referred to them as, quote, cheap and nasty, and they had a shortage of them to begin with. Now, the real defense that worked, and we're going to see this, was air defense against submarines. It was lethal, but they had very little of it. These were the British had 2 different aircraft. They used a Sunderland flying boat and Catalina, but there were very few in numbers. Arthur Harris, who was head of he was the equivalent of Hap Arnold in Britain, was a stringent believer in strategic bombing, so many air assets were siphoned off for the bombing campaign against Germany early on, and the Atlantic was sort of starved. Now, they did have some technology. This is ASDIC. You may have heard of this as sonar. The British had developed it in 1917. They were quite proud of it. And this is how it worked. It sent out, the transponder was underneath the ship on the hull, and it would send out these sound waves. You could see it could hit whales, all kinds of things. And then it would bounce off and echo back, and they'd read the echo and be able to track the submarine. That was the idea. Now, the Germans quite figured out early on that if you simply attacked on the surface, forget ASDIC. It just didn't work. For weapons, they had depth charges. These could be set. They would set them calibrate them at the depth, and then just drop them over the side. That was the main counter weapon that they actually had. Now, one other thing we should talk about here, which has gotten increasing attention in the history of World War II, which is code breaking in codes. And it took us some time to even recognize that this was a factor in World War II, but it was an important one, and certainly in the Battle of the Atlantic. This was the main code machine that the Germans had. This was called, this Enigma machine, it was an electromechanical rotor, and I must admit to you, I don't fully understand how it works. It looks like a portable typewriter, right? It had, you can see, this is, the original ones had 3 rotors on the top. This one has 4. They added that 4th one later. And you would type on it like a typewriter, and there were gears inside that would change the letters around. And so you had, on the other hand, the message you're getting, you had to have a decode book, and they changed the code every day. And the Germans were so confident it was impossible to break this thing, because there were like 2 trillion to 1 you could ever figure out what the message was. Well, at Bletchley House in London, they did break the code. They did it in a series, and first they did it against the 3-rotor machine, and then it took the 4-rotor, but they were able to read some of the German traffic on the Atlantic. Enigma machine, the Germans had so much confidence in it that it was used extensively. Here it was used by the Army. You can see Heinz Guderian with an Enigma machine. You can see it down to the lower left. Standard 1-2 was used extensively. So if we stop with, we've kind of introduced things to you with phase 1, we can see that there were a lot of limitations and frustrations on both sides in the early part of the war, both the Germans and the British with their limitations and frustrations. And then we have phase 2, which comes rather dramatically in June of 1940. And does anybody know what happens in World War II in June of 1940? Giving part of it away. France falls, Norway falls, and as one of you have noticed already, that makes a huge difference here now with the submarine warfare. France gets complicated. If you don't believe me, just watch Casablanca. Who are all these French they keep talking about? Vichy French, Free French, and so on. You can see there were actually at least 3 kinds of French. The occupied zone, this was after the fall of France in June of 1940. The occupied zone the Germans kept. Notice how they keep the entire Atlantic coast of France. That's going to be important to our story. And then that little rump purple state at the bottom was the Vichy Republic that was allowed to be we really should say semi-independent. They were able to keep the empire though, for North Africa and Indochina and so on at that point. And then you can't see it off the map was one of the most colorful personalities of World War II, Charles de Gaulle, in London, the head of the Free French. So we actually have, Louis, in Casablanca, he goes from being a Vichy Frenchman to a Free Frenchman at the end of the movie as he switches sides. Notice that the container of water they throw in the trash can is Vichy water, right? Yeah. So it helps to know all these things, I think, if you see the movie. Well, so we're going to have a whole new set of problems. One was the weather got a lot worse on the Atlantic. The other thing is Dönitz got more boats. And he told Hitler he needed 300, and he begins to get more support. So this is a good phase for the Germans, generally. And that's a map of France. You can see here we begin, this is where the submarine facilities are going to be concentrated. So they don't have to go around the top of Scotland anymore. They have this direct access right there to the Atlantic. And here's Dönitz in France at Saint-Nazaire in June 1941. He has relocated his whole operation now to the west coast of France. This is a picture I took rather desperately through a car window about a year ago. I must admit I wasn't in France to be studying submarines. This is Bordeaux, and I love wine. So I was wine tasting, and as the guide was driving me back to my hotel, he said, and by the way, here's a submarine pen from World War II. I said, what, a submarine pen from World War II? So out came the camera, I happened to click it. That's what they look like. They really were heavily bunkered, and they began to build these in Western France. And Norway. Norway became a real nuisance because they had air patrols that operated out of there, shipping that operated out of there, in addition to the submarines. And look at how it wraps around the entire coast there in the north. The Condor, they had air support now. And the Condors, the Luftwaffe, this increased communication connections to the wolf packs as they began to develop. They could transmit radio signals from the submarines to Western France and back again to coordinate their operations and to track the convoys when they came through. And then one of my favorite things, in German, the milk cows. Milk cow, right? These large submarines that could supply the German submarines out into the ocean so they could sustain their operations longer. They didn't have to go back to port. And the milk cows were a very important addition here. And so now here we are, phase 2, Norway and France, and notice the dots move out further in the Atlantic. Bigger challenge now.
So what are the dots?
Right there.
Yeah, what are they? Are they
Sinkings.
sinking?
I'm sorry, yeah, they're ships that get sunk, yeah. Now, the Wolfpack system was in full operation, and radio improved things. So what was a Wolfpack? How did it operate? Dönitz quickly discovered that just like you concentrate the surface ships in a convoy, you concentrate the submarines, you get more effect. What he would use is radio to track the convoy. Then the submarines would rendezvous at a point where the convoy would pass. They would be ready. Often lined up perpendicular to the convoy, and they just wait. And then when the convoy gets there, the battle starts. And often they would infiltrate. A lot of this is going on at night. So it would be carefully coordinated with Western France. Just leave that up there for a second. It's now in phase 2 is when the US starts to get involved. In July 1940, the British merchant shipbuilding mission arrived in the US with $69 million to spend on ship construction to build what were called 60 ocean-class ships to deal with the losses they were getting in phase 1. 30 of these initial ships would be built on the East Coast, but the problem with the East Coast shipbuilding industry, which was much more experienced than the West Coast, was it was saturated with orders. The American Navy was starting to rebuild, so they had to come to the West Coast for the other 30, and that's where Richmond gets involved. Henry J. Kaiser partners with the Todd ship operation. He loved to partner with people. They start substantially altering the waterfront. So we begin here in Richmond with building British cargo ships, the initial 30 contract before we evolve and segue into the Liberty ships. FDR gets steadily more committed to Britain in this phase to support. He's alarmed at the U-boat, and one of the first things he does is to extend the U.S. security zone out into the Atlantic to support the British. Still, we had something called the Atlantic Gap, and this was a real worry for anybody who had anything to do with cargo shipping. In other words, the Atlantic Gap, that was as far as air cover could reach out in the Atlantic, as far as, and then it left about a 300-mile gap where they weren't covered, and they were really vulnerable in that stretch of ocean. It was about 300 miles from east to west, about 600 miles north to south. This was a devastating phase for the British. Now that Dönitz has his condors, he has more submarines, he has France, he has a milk house, and we have a really difficult period here for the British. One of the worst incidents took place in October 1940, when one convoy lost 20 out of 35 ships in one night. It could have been worse, but the U-boats ran out of torpedoes. In the last 6 months of 1940, the British lost 331 ships. You can see the pressing need now for more ships, faster built, get them out as quickly as possible. What I wanted to do also was pause here a little bit while we're in phase two and talk about what was it like, because I sometimes think about this as I also volunteer on the Red Oak. What was it like to be aboard one of these cargo ships during when all this is happening out there in the Atlantic? And it was a difficult war both for the people of the cargo ships and for the Germans. First of all, this alone would keep me from doing it, because I get seasick on a bucket of water. These were the conditions on the Atlantic that these crews had to deal with a great deal of the time. In summer it was clear. Sometimes the ships had high visibility. That was dangerous because it also was a lot of visibility for the submarines. In winter, the Atlantic ice pack drove the ships closer to the coast. This is a torpedo tanker. So if you went down with one of these, if you were aboard the crew, what was it like? Well, let's take a look at that. If a ship sank on the Arctic run to Murmansk along the Norway coast, and you had a life vest on, and you got into those waters, you would survive for 60 seconds unless you were picked up. Hypothermia would get you. If you were part of a crew of a tanker with oil, the ship would burn for hours. Worse was a tanker filled with gasoline. The whole thing could go up in one explosion. If you were on a cargo ship with iron ore, it was so heavy, the whole ship could go down in 1 minute. So a lot of men simply, especially people working in the engine room, that kind of thing, would simply go down with the ship. They wouldn't even have a fighting chance. Life for the crews was difficult. Those who did survive got very little government support. The British side of things, you had to rely on private charity if you survived a torpedoing, and the British government gave you 30 pounds a month. That was it. I remember reading an oral history of a guy in Richmond. He was a bartender, and he went down on a tanker toward the beginning of the war, and they gave him $300, and he says, not enough. He went back to tending bar after that. And this is what could happen to you if you were lucky. And here are two surviving crew members who look the worse for wear, British crew members. There was no picnic aboard a U-boat. Here are the German submarine crew. You had, it was cramped. You had 2 berths for every 3 sailors, 1 toilet for 40 to 50 men. Everything was done in shifts, sharing the beds and so on. The worst, they all agreed, was a depth charge attack, where you simply go down and grit your teeth and hope one of those things didn't sink the ship, but you could outlast the barrage. So we now enter phase 3, December of 1941 until May of 1943, and you know what happens in December of 1941, right? Now the United States will become fully involved in this conflict. Actually, in 1941, 2 enormously important countries will enter World War II in terms of post-war history. The United States, but also the Soviet Union in the summer of that year. both depended heavily on cargo shipping, so we have yet an escalation in our need here for more and more cargo ships. The United States, FDR began dealing with the problem of isolationism in the United States, which is resistance to build up in preparation for war. I have a couple lectures on that, on isolationism and so on, and Lend-Lease, where I get into this in more detail, but it was a continuing challenge for him and members of the Congress. The Neutrality Acts were severe restrictions on his ability to supply. The Neutrality Acts made it illegal to sell arms to any belligerent. They didn't even want to enter into this problem of who's right and who's wrong. You couldn't lend money, all of these things. One of the reasons that Lend-Lease is developed is he's not actually selling things, he's lending them, right? That was the great myth of Lend-Lease. FDR, don't forget, he was a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He began building up the American Navy intensely at this time. In 1936, the U.S. Maritime Commission was established, and this is really important because the ships that are built here in Richmond will be built largely under the U.S. Maritime Commission. Some $13 billion was set aside for merchant ships. $6.3 billion went to the West Coast, and there were 14 shipyards here in the Bay Area that actually were engaged in ship production. What were they building? Well, here's a tanker. We didn't build any of these here, as far as I know. Marin Ship in Sausalito did, however. This is your standard. This was the equivalent of the Liberty ship, except for fuel. And here's the Liberty ship. This is the Jeremiah O'Brien, which you can see today in San Francisco. 10,000-ton ship. There were 2,700 of these built. And then our very own Red Oak Victory ship. By the way, we're having pancakes on Sunday. If you want to get aboard a Victory ship and eat pancakes, you can do both in one day. One of the first things FDR did was to deal with the escort problem. Churchill was begging him for destroyers with the Corvette situation. They'd lost a lot of destroyers in the Norway campaign and in Dunkirk, so they were really short of escort ships. So again, you can't sell, you can't loan. So does anybody know how FDR got the British their 50 destroyers in 1940? What he did? No? We got 99-year leases on British bases for this. This was so clever on Roosevelt's part. He said, I didn't break the law. No, we traded the ships for the bases. And where are the bases? They were in Canada, they were in the Caribbean. So the isolationists, he said, you really want to protect the United States? We got these other bases now in exchange for this to protect the United States. So he kind of quieted the isolationist faction for a short time with that as well. But the big thing, this is one of the most important pieces of legislation in World War II, was Lend-Lease, I think. And this was signed by Roosevelt in March of 1941. This is, by the way, you know who this cartoonist is, right? Dr. Seuss. He was an avid interventionist. He cartooned against the isolationists and against Lindbergh and people like that. And here's his pro-Lend-Lease cartoon. There's a whole book out on Dr. Seuss's World War II cartoons. They're wonderful, and he was, again, very active. And then here's a more sobering look at Lend-Lease. When it kicked into high gear, the United States began supplying the world, the Allies, China, Soviet Union, Britain, with shipping, cargo shipping again. So again, the importance of the cargo ship here. We also start in little sneaky ways to get more and more involved in the Battle of the Atlantic. And it shouldn't surprise anyone that incidents began to happen between the Germans and the Americans out in the Atlantic. We begin providing escorts for the British in the fall of 1941, even before Pearl Harbor. We began furnishing the Royal Navy about German submarine activity in the Atlantic. If any American ships would spot submarines, they would relay the information to the British. And predictably, there were incidents that would happen. One of the most famous was with the Reuben James. This was October 31st, 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. 100 American crew members were killed in a submarine attack. And then one of the strangest things that a lot of people don't know about, our occupation of Iceland, which took place in June of 1941, which again thrusts us in another way out into the Atlantic. We did that to basically relieve British and Canadian troops so they could fight in other theaters. And then finally, of course, our declaration of war that happened on December 8th, 1941. Now, originally, we were woefully unprepared for the Battle of the Atlantic ourselves, and things don't go well for the United States early on in this. And here is some sinking off. In fact, the submariners, the German submariners referred to their attacks off the coast of the United States as the happy time. They sank so many tankers and so many ships that it was like a picnic for them. These ships, the U-boats came so close to the coast that a lot of Americans remember seeing them. They were that close. And what's really going on here is most of our oil, 95% of it that came out of the Gulf, had to be shipped. There were no pipelines, so they had to ship it around, and it became extremely vulnerable. And there were two reasons why it was vulnerable. First was that we didn't use convoys. Ernest King, at the beginning of the war, didn't believe in convoys. That was one thing. But the other thing is, believe it or not, I always find this hard to believe. They wouldn't, the East Coast cities would not shut their lights off at night. And so what the German submarines learned to do, like let's take Miami, for example, it would be all lit up, right? So they would position themselves, and a tanker would come, and he had this beautiful slow-moving silhouette right against the lights and sink the ship. One German captain even talked about how one of his favorite things to do to kill time was to watch the traffic in Miami. He looked through his periscope. They were that close to the East Coast, and the sinkings were prolific. The other dangerous thing we talked about, we'd examined as the Arctic route. This was really lethal for cargo ships and their crews, and you can see the routes that they had to follow here. This was only one of three ways that Lend-Lease supplied Russia. One was to the Persian Gulf, and the other was Vladivostok in the Pacific. But this was the dangerous one, the one that the crews dreaded. The first Arctic convoy left in September 1941. It was called the Murmansk Run, and they had to face a gauntlet along the Norwegian coast of German resistance. Double use on that picture. This looks just awful to me. I can't imagine this. Let's just take one convoy. It was called PQ-17. It left Iceland in July 1942 with 32 merchant ships on the Murmansk Run. After a savage attack by both U-boats and German aircraft, the convoy lost 23 of its 34 ships. And it caused the Allies to stop the convoys altogether for the rest of the summer. The person who was livid, you might not be surprised to hear, was Joseph Stalin. When he heard that these convoys were not happening, he pitched a fit. Dönitz ended up with more U-boats. So the things look really grim in early 1943 as we begin to have huge numbers of sinkings here. The United States, Soviet Union have entered the war. But then comes the great reversal, and it happened really quickly. There's some ships from PQ-17. The Casablanca Conference in January 1943. This involved it was not, Stalin was not present for this. It was strictly Churchill and Roosevelt. And one of the things they agreed they were going to do, this is January 1943, is to make the Battle of the Atlantic, the submarine threat, one of the high priority items for their to-do list as they enter 1943. Also at this point on the German side, Dönitz finally had his goal reached. He was made head of the entire German Navy. Riveter had been dismissed. So now he can escalate the priority for submarine construction. But on the Allied side, there were all kinds of changes that made all kinds of differences. Let's take a look at what's going to happen here. First of all, the escort vessels get much better in much larger numbers, and they learn how to use tactics against the submarines that are lethal for submarine warfare. This is a destroyer escort. It's smaller than a normal escort ship. It's a little slower, but its specialty is submarine warfare. It was designed for that. New weapon, the Hedgehog. These could be projected out into the ocean as opposed to just dropped over the side, and they were detonated by contact. A much more effective weapon than we had before. Escort carriers, or baby carriers, as they were sometimes called. By the way, Henry J. Kaiser was one of the big advocates for these. So you could now have floating air protection as part of a convoy, and they began to make large numbers of these. They made a huge difference in terms of the survival. Portable radar that you could begin to have on both ships and planes in World War II as we came in. And this meant that the night protection didn't work very well anymore with radar. As Dick got better, the original one had a mile range, and then this came in, Huff Duff it was called, which was a way of detecting radio signals. So as soon as the U-boats began to say, I'm here, I've located it, that became a tracking device for how to find that submarine using this new technology. Simple things aboard the aircraft, the lee light, the huge bright light that could just spot, as it's doing here, a submarine. But probably the most important thing was now they had B-24s patrolling the Atlantic, and these things were deadly to submarine. They had a 2,200-mile range. They could often catch submarines on the surface. And now it's time to bring Richmond back into the picture. The final development that made the difference, record production of cargo ships in places like Richmond. They just overwhelmed the German U-boat force. By the end of 1943, the U.S. was making 6 times as many ships as the German U-boats could sink. They manufactured 5 times as much as Japan, 3 times as much as Germany. The Richmond shipyards alone produced 747 ships. You've probably heard the legendary story of Richmond, the Robert Peary, that was produced in a little more than 4 days. It's still a record here in Richmond. By the way, my friend Steve Guilford, who wrote a wonderful book on Henry J. Kaiser that's available here in the bookstore, he was telling me a story one time that when news of the Peary got out, the ship they made here in Richmond that broke the world record, it got back to, first of all, Joseph Goebbels in Germany, and Goebbels told Hitler, this place called Richmond, California is producing these ships in a little bit more than 4 days. And you know what Hitler's response was? Fake news. You know? Today isn't the first time the phrase is used. In May of 1943 alone, 41 U-boats went down. Catastrophe.
May of 40 what?
This was May of 1943. May was the month that it turned around quickly. With early 41, big trouble, and now by By May, all these different deterrents had kicked in at the same time. To make matters particularly difficult for Admiral Dönitz in that same month, he lost his own son, Peter, on one of the U-boats. Disappeared. And that same month, Dönitz pulled the wolf packs out of the Atlantic. The way was cleared for D-Day and for the rest of World War II. Well, what have we learned here? Yeah.
Do you think Dönitz knew by May of 43, or at least the summer of 43, that the war was over? Or at least that they were going to be defeated?
I'm pretty sure he did. And he was an extremely intelligent and clear-headed sort of person. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And of course, you're aware that he's the one that, he officially was the one that was head of the Third Reich when Germany surrendered after Hitler's suicide. So bitter, yeah.
So you've shown us 4 or 5 different new weapons
Yeah.
that the United States created. Who was in charge of that? Who decided that these particular ships and planes would do the job to get the U-boats out of the Atlantic? Who was the Secretary of the Navy at that time?
The Secretary of the Navy at that time, let me see. I can tell you the Chief of Staff of the Navy was. That was Ernest King, who obviously had a lot to do with this. The Chief of Staff, the Secretary, I think, was Frank Knox, if I'm not mistaken.
So I'm just sort of wondering, was it like one person's idea that this is what we needed, or was it a committee that decided that?
Well, there was a combined general staff that was operating in World War II, British and American. It was the first time they'd done this, that the 2 joint staffs were working as one. I don't really know the answer to the question, but I suspect they had a lot to do with it. And Roosevelt and Churchill both were very personally involved with this stuff. I mean, they knew about a lot of these technologies. It made a difference that Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, I think.
Sort of a PS to his question, which is, what was the Silicon Valley of this period of the war? In other words, you've got this amazing expansion and development of the technology, as well as just weapons manufacturing and the B-24 and so forth. Was there a concentrated places in the U.S., or was it all under the roof of the Navy, where all of this new development, new technology was happening?
Yeah, a lot of it, well, I have one talk I give on California in the war, and this is where California was, especially places like Caltech, were really starting to assert themselves in terms of high technology warfare technology. But I don't think you would have had the equivalent of a Silicon Valley, any single system like that. And then the British are doing a lot of this as well. The British had developed radar before anybody had, and as did. And then they're the ones at Bletchley House that had broken the code. So it's not all American by any means, all this technology. What really made the difference, I think, one way to look at it, is the productive capacity of this country. That really is an important part of our story. I mean, Joseph Stalin, who certainly knew World War II as well as anybody, once said World War II was won by Russian men and American industry. That's something to think about if you're in World War II, because I think that's succinct, but I think it also describes it. And this is one statistic I'll leave you with, all the numbers we've talked about today. And that is that when World War II ended in 1945, the United States had 50% of the world's industrial productive capacity in one country. That kind of economic dominance had never happened in world history before. We were poised in the post-war world to be dominant as no country had ever been dominant before. And this shipyard, the Richmond shipyard, was an important part of that story. And the whole concept, for example, one of the things that we innovated was the assembly line. That it started with automobile production, but Kaiser picked up on that. And these ships used an assembly line approach to be successful. The B-24 plant at Willow Run, same thing. They set up a giant assembly line, kind of like we had at the Ford plant here for making Model A's. That became a kind of prototype for how things could be mass produced and standardized. And then you broke all the, which you did here at the shipyards, you broke all the chores down that were easily learned and specifics. You could take people off of farms and from areas where they had no industrial experience and train them very quickly and produce these very standardized weapons that they did. But that's the stories of these shipyards is an important story of World War II. And the Battle of the Atlantic, in some ways, I think, reminds us of the importance of this. Because sometimes when we talk about World War II, I don't think we pay enough attention to things like logistics and manufacturing. Yeah.
Jim, is there any evidence that American military was anticipating the potential for a war with Japan and deciding to build ships on the West Coast for the Atlantic?
Yeah, I notice I don't mention Asia much in this whole thing. We went to a two-ocean navy in 1940. That was, and then the fleet moved out to Pearl Harbor. But I don't get much reference to Asia and this whole thing as far as the cargo shipping was concerned. The focus really did seem to be on Britain and Europe and that kind of thing, at least at this phase of the war. As the war went on, of course, that changed. I mean, and we began to build ships here that were more suitable for the Pacific, like the smaller cargo ships that went from island to island and began to supply for the Pacific War. But initially, I don't get that emphasis, at least from what I've seen of things.
Well, the industrial base that you mentioned.
Yeah.
The extent of the mobilization of the non-fighting American public during the Second World War was simply amazing.
Yeah.
My mother worked a night shift in a munitions plant in Turlock, California, for at least a couple of years during the war.
What's astonishing is the organizational ability here. I suspect that, I think one thing I would always do when I taught is I'd connect the following three things for my students. Depression, New Deal, World War II. It's not accidental that the Roosevelt administration bridges this whole period. Because you had, if we think of when the Great Depression began in 1929, the only contact most Americans had with the federal government was when they went to the mailbox. That was it. No Social Security, no Federal Housing Administration, none of those things. But those programs, those large-scale programs, I think help prep the society, help prep the economy for the kind of scale that would be needed here. If you think about it, this story is breathtaking. They had to not only recover from the Great Depression, but they had to supply the Allies in a wartime situation and to manage things like rationing, housing, transportation, all of these things. It's an amazing story. And so you can see how America was so successful in the post-war period, because you've got a whole generation of people who are corporatized, basically. They're serving in the Army, they're working in heavy industry, and they knew how to do large-scale production, how to organize human beings to do that, and then the technologies that were necessary to do it. Everything was in place for, really American dominance of the world economy in the post-war period. But a lot of it was learned here. And don't forget, a person who comes here, I was going to end with a story about one shipyard worker. I'll use the story because I think it illustrates a little bit of what we're talking about. There were two, it's an oral history, there was a woman who, she was a student at UC Berkeley, and her brother was in charge of hiring here at the shipyards, and told her, look, drop out of school temporarily, work at the shipyards, because the yards paid really well, and you can save money and then go back to school, when the war is over, that kind of thing. So she did. She came, her name was Denise Flagg. She came here and, like so many women, she became a welder. That was where they channeled most of the women who worked in the yards in welding. In fact, 40% of the welders here were female by the end of the war. And she met this woman. Here she is, a UC student, right? from a really comfortable family. She meets this woman from Arkansas. And the woman had been barefoot, incredible poverty, no education whatsoever. And they become friends. And the woman's name from Arkansas was Palestine, and they called her Tiny because she was apparently a really small woman. And they went out on a ferry boat on the bay one day because Denise lived in San Francisco, so we were going to take her. And this woman had never been on a boat. She's building ships, but she'd never been on a boat. So she goes out, and she's looking at the water. She says, "The water has bumps on it." "What are the bumps?" And then he says, "Those are waves." "Oh, okay." So we take somebody like that, who's never seen the ocean, never been on a boat, and we train them here what's going to happen to these people in the post-war period. When they have this training, they have this experience. But they even have like a larger sense of the world that they didn't have before. And when you think about stories like that, you begin to see the transformative effect of World War II and the effect it had on civilians and military both. Mm-hmm.
So do you know what happened to those two women, sort of after the war?
I don't know what happened to Tiny. In fact, I don't even know if she stayed in Richmond, because a lot of people left. Denise, I think, went back to school and ended up, I think, as a teacher. I'm not sure. Yeah, she wasn't here very long. A lot of people weren't. This is really hard work. It was hard to do this work for very long. Welding was tough. Yeah.
In a short statement, I don't want to take too much of your time, just how did the Liberty ships get east?
I'm sorry?
How did the Liberty ships get east? How did they go east?
What was
How did they go east?
How did they get to Europe?
What was the route?
Oh, they had to go through the canal.
Okay.
One thing, yeah. And then, yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. It's a long haul just to get them to where they can join the convoys. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I did an article recently on for the Richmond Mirror because I realized that no one had determined how many of the cargo ships built here sank. And I discovered these sources, which were, and I kind of matched them together. One was all the U.S. cargo ships that sank in World War II, from all the shipyards, and they would list the and then I had all the Richmond ships built. So I laid all the stuff out on the table. I was matching all these things, and it's interesting how the sinkings went down. Of the 30 of those original British ships, 7 of them were sunk by U-boats. The Liberty ships, if I remember, I think it was like of the 500 and something, only about 22, 23. But only 2 Richmond-built Victory ships sank in World War II, both at Okinawa, both side by side, result of kamikaze attacks. It did change over time. Yeah.
The difference between the Victory and the Liberty ships?
Main thing was the engine. Because what they were after was speed. Again, the Liberties were too slow at 11 knots. Victory could hit 18, is that right? Something like that. It's because of the change in the engine. You have a steam turbine engine on the Victory, and you have the triple expansion steam engine on the Liberty. The reason they didn't put steam turbines in originally is there's a shortage of them. There were so many were going to naval ships. But as the productive capacity improved, they could put them on cargo ships, and so. Yeah, and then the Victory was also a little longer, it was a little wider, it was a little sleeker. But the main thing was speed and the engine.
I remember there was a memorial in Dublin about the 3,000 or 4,000 Irishmen that died on the merchant ships.
The Merchant Marine, in my opinion, they're the unsung heroes of World War II. Huge numbers of those people died. And they were civilians, I mean, technically, but I don't think they get nearly the recognition for World War II
shabbily treated during and after.
Yeah, I mean, it just, for example, I don't think they were eligible for the GI Bill, I don't think.
Only recently.
Yeah.
Weren't the Liberty ships riveted versus welded for the Victories?
They were both welded.
They were.
That was the main change, because they used to rivet ships, and they discovered, just before the war, in Texas, I think, at a shipyard, that you could weld them a lot faster. That's what, again, speed. And riveting is a slow process. It's a good process, but it's slow. So you don't, like if you look around the Red Oak Victory, you'll see some rivets. They weren't completely, but it's welding that. By the way, the one thing, every time I do the pancake breakfast at the ship, I always look at the wells. Because I heard, this has always intrigued me, you can tell the difference between a male and a female weld. I've heard this from more in oral history from more shipbuilders, that women were better welders generally. And one guy said it was because they did crocheting, so they were really precise with their work, and you could really tell. So I keep looking at these welds. Is that a female weld? Male weld on the ship. But they also did, it was arc welding, and it was also what's called downhand welding, which means you don't weld over your head. So they'd flip the whole ship in the prefabrication thing and weld it, and then flip it back and put it on the whirling crane and set it down on the ship. All of this was done because it took, you could train a person faster. It didn't take as much skill as traditional welding did. All of it is just fast, 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 speed, speed, speed. They were, in fact, that's one thing Kaiser did, is he loved to pit people against each other. So Richmond Yard was always pit against the Portland Yard. His son managed the Portland Yard, and a guy named Clay Bedford managed the Richmond Yard. And the reason they built Robert Perry in 4 days is that Portland had built one in 10 days. And Kaiser made a big thing of it in Richmond, like, are you guys as good as the Portland ones or whatever? And then they went crazy and built the Robert Perry in a little over 4 days. It was kind of a publicity stunt, really, that they did. Yeah.
So if the ships weren't riveted, why is it called Rosie the Riveter?
Bingo. Can I introduce you to a second character?
Yes.
Wendy the Welder. There you go. I know. But what it was really, if you look at the overall home front question, aircraft still did a lot of riveting. And there were more women, percentage-wise, building aircraft. And Southern California was the center for aircraft production. Then there were women working in the shipyards. That became a heavily female. You probably know the story. Marilyn Monroe was one of them. She was discovered as an aircraft worker in Southern California.
Wasn't the original Rosie from Michigan anyway? She wasn't from here?
Boy, I always duck original Rosie question. Because it's not clear. I heard it was a woman in Alameda.
I heard East Coast, like Delaware or something, but.
Yeah, I mean, who the original Rosie was, I don't really know.
A photographer made a decision.
There's two things I learned being a staff historian. I was a staff historian for the Air Force for 10 years, is try to never use words like first and only. As there's somebody in the staff who's going to say, you said the first this was built, but I know of one that was built 18 months, and you look bad. If you just say, like, this person might have been a Rosie, maybe the first one, you're on safer ground. Yeah.
So I'm wondering how many of the ships that were built in Richmond, the Victory and the Liberty, are still extant somewhere, and are any of them actually operational that could, like, sail the seas?
That's an easy one. Robert can answer that one. The answer
ship.
is
It's right over across the other side of the channel.
right here, just one.
This one.
Yeah.
And it is operational. If we had permission, we could sail her tomorrow.
The
Where's
Red
the ship?
Yeah, Robert's on the Red Oak Victory crew.
Shipyard 3, the other side of.
It's on Shipyard 3, yeah.
The other side of it.
The other side of Santa Fe Channel. So we're at the Ford plant. If you go that, well, whichever direction, across the channel that the ships come into, the Ford, the other side of that channel is Shipyard number 3, and that's where the ship is.
And it's
so if you
open
wanna
on
come in
Sundays.
for breakfast on Sunday morning.
Oh,
We start serving at 9.
oh.
You can get pancakes and a tour.
At the end of Canal Boulevard.
Well,
Yeah.
so that's, it actually operates. I didn't think it did.
It can.
It can. Okay, so my next
Right.
question.
You get into
I've had
a lot of controversy about that ship and why it's not operating.
Yeah. So.
If we have a swell of public opinion, that will help considerably in getting
yes.
permissions.
If you want to write a letter to your congressman,
Okay, well, so.
Congressman is all in favor of it.
That's true. Another conversation.
So the follow-up question
Yeah.
is, you know, I thought these pancake breakfasts were fundraisers.
They are.
To help maintain or repair the ship so that it could operate. Okay, so if you had all the money you needed and you didn't have to do pancake breakfast anymore, I mean, how much money would you need to make the ship the way you want it?
Are you ready for this?
Yeah.
Because it needs to be dry docked. It hasn't been dry docked, it's overdue. The figure I have, maybe Robert has a better one, because I went to a briefing, Port Authority here, but they talked about this. To move it, they want to move it from where it is to closer to the ferry terminal. That's the expensive part. And to dry dock it would probably be about a total of $15 million. Does that sound
I
right?
think for $100,000, we could be in better shape than we are now.
Yeah.
We could be roughly comparable to the Jeremiah.
Dry dock alone would be a couple $1 million.
No, well, no, that's, well, dry dock, yeah.
Dry dock, yeah. Just repairs would probably.
We are in good condition now,
Right.
so there are things that would have to be done in dry dock, but to do the full outfit, yeah, that would be a lot of money.
Yeah.
But we don't need.
And we have to tow it to Mare Island and everything for dry dock.
Yeah, that's the only dry docks that remain at this point.
But it's the only, now that Jeremiah O'Brien was not built in Richmond, that was built in Maine, so that doesn't count. But it's, that you can also, if you're really curious about a Liberty ship, that would be the one to see. And it's in really good condition. Yeah,
Do you have any gluten-free pancakes?
no. But I'm the one that takes the orders, so we can give you extra bacon. We do that. I shouldn't put that out there. Because you're the one that has to get the bacon.
I have to ask my cardiologist
There you go.
first.
Yeah, right.
Is it possible for me to bring my bike?
What I really hope is I can see you again for part two, which is the end of the month. It's on a Sunday, it's 2:30, whatever the last Sunday of July is. When I talk about these shipyards, we've said a few things today, but to really get into how the ships were built.
Depends on.
So I'd love to see you all again.
Do you have a calendar online? You do a calendar online?
Yes, if you go to Rosie the Riveter Visitor Center, you'll find it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You could bring it up again, that's possible. We've got Rosie's that.
You already here?
Walk
I second.
up the gangway and walk that.
Yeah, this was excellent.
You know, I'm always interested in
It couldn't.
political decisions